Hello, I'm Elaine Ragland with a very special Sun City resident. Most of us in Sun City have relocated from other parts of the country. Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in Bluffton in the early 1900s? Were there any roads or grocery stores? How did residents travel to Hilton Head or Savannah? Warren McGarvey shares with us some of his lifelong memories about growing up in the Beaufort County Lowcountry. His family lived in a home passed down from his maternal grandparents, where US 278 and South Carolina 170 meet, and which will forever be known as McGarvey's Corner. Welcome, Lauren, to Sun City TV News.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
The name McGarvey has a great meaning around here because of McGarvey's Corner. Can you tell us a little bit about your father and about the history in the Lowcountry?
Well, my dad was a Marine, and he met my mother here, and he was the bandmaster at Paris Island at the time, and the way they met was that he came over here, and there's a place called Harrison Island, which is where you go to the St. Andrew's Catholic Church. And there's a road that turns to your right, goes over to the little island, and at that time they had a pavilion over there which they had dances. And my dad would bring some Marines over from the band and they would play for the dancers. And it turned out that that's where he met my mother. And of course that's when the courting started, and he would come from Paris Island with a ferry to Buckingham, which was then just the end of the road. And he'd walk from Buckingham to the head of the road, which is where the house was, called McGarvey's Corner. And they eventually got married, and then I was born on Paris Island and at the hospital. And my mother said I was the first baby born in that hospital. They had no maternity ward at that time. And that was back in 1925. So it turned out that my dad was sent over to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, right after I was born, and with the Marine garrison to quell a voodoo uprising against their government. And when I was 8 months old, my mother and I went over to stay with him, and we were at a apartment upstairs. I'll never forget that the fact that I fell down those stairs going up there, which were concrete stairs. And that's what's wrong with me today. I got a few bumps on my head and very little in it. But anyway, we came back to the States. My mother and I, my dad stayed over there until it was over, but we came back, and it was, I was about 4 years old, couldn't speak a word of English because we had Haitian maids, and that's all I heard because my mother was busy most of the time, and she was baking on a 4-burner kerosene stove, 75 pies a day to have dessert for the Marines. So that meant that I didn't see her too often. And of course at that age, I don't guess it really made too much difference one way or the other. But when we came back to the States, back then, it was very unusual, especially today. But if you could go to the bathroom by yourself, age made no difference. You went to school. So I started at the Bluffton school at a very early age. And back in those days, if most of you recall, that was back during the Depression days. Well, back here, the Depression was just another day for us because we lived on a little farm, we raised our own food, and back then, you didn't have to worry about going anywhere because there was nowhere to go other than Sunday. Everybody went to church. So when my mother, being the only organist in this section of the country, played at 3 different churches every Sunday. The May River Baptist Church was down near 46 and 170, where they met at the circle down there at 11 o'clock service on Sunday morning. And at 1 o'clock service, went to the Bull Hill Methodist Church, which is the one right next to us here. And then in the afternoon, we went to Indian Hill Baptist Church, and that was 7 o'clock in the evening. So I have really been raised a very confused Christian, because every one of the churches had a different idea of how to preach and treat and try to teach us Christianity. But anyway, it turned out that after we grew up, I went to school in Bluffton for 10 years. And the 11th year, back then we only had 11 grades, but the 11th year I went with two other guys. We transferred over to Ridgeland High School. And the reason for that was because we couldn't afford any sports in Bluffton. And not only that, we only had about 124 students in the 11th grade, and most of them were bused in from the little farms and so forth. And so they had all the sports in Ridgeland, so three of us went there, Lawrence Boulware, Troy Bennett, and myself. We boarded with a lady there and had one room, and the three of us stayed in one room Monday through Friday, came home on the weekends, and basically that's the way our lives started here in the Lowcountry.
Warren, can you tell me a little bit about your grandfather and how he purchased the property at McGarvey's Corner?
The property was owned by my grandmother and grandfather, and it was purchased back in December the 27th, I think, of 1897. And I think my grandfather paid $400 for the 13 acres. Back then, land was probably 25 cents an acre or something of that nature, unless it was location, as you know, is what they say about property. And but my grandmother came down here from Charleston to teach school at the one-room schoolhouse. They met and they got married, and when they got married, he bought that property, built a two-room house with a kitchen and a bedroom, and then they started having a family. And every year that my grandmother was expecting a child, they added a room. Now, she had 9 children, but she had a set of twins, so they only added 7 more rooms. And you could tell every place a room was built, because back then, as far as level was concerned, what you had to do, someone would hold a board up, and the other guy would say, move it a little, hold it there, and then hammer it in, and you could tell where every room is added into that house. But it was a good thing they built it that way, because we had no electricity until 1947, didn't get a phone until 1956, and as you know, folks, all of you were probably here during those years, and that wasn't too long ago.
Well, we have a picture of the house here from an article in the newspaper of April 24th of the year 2000. And this is a picture of the McGarvey residence here, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and how much of that existed at the time that you grew up?
All of it.
Okay.
Yeah, all of the house was there. And it was one of the rooms added on the back of the house, which really was not I think it was used as a bedroom back then, but it had, what kind of gas did they use back then to light a house with? I can't remember. Mm-hmm. But it was, but it was different than kerosene lamps, because we were raised with kerosene lamps.
You were telling me that your father fortified the house because of its location. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we were at the head of the Fording Island Road, as you know it, but we used to call it just the head of the road, because that was the road that went, at that time, only went to Bluffton. Mm-hmm. And no roads were paved back in those days. And then after the roads were paved, which was, let me see, that was my first job, as a matter of fact. I was a night watchman during the summer in 1939. Paid 25 cents an hour, which was big money back in those days, especially here in the country. And it was, I'd say, I would say about 1939, about 1940, my dad started building what he called his marginal line out front of the house, because people would, on Saturday, would always go out partying, and they would get high as a kite on moonshine probably, and they wouldn't stop, so most of them would stop right up in the front yard before they hit the porch. And so my dad says, I'll stop that, and he built what he called his marginal line, which was nothing but great big hunks of, which he built the forms, and old Joe Pinkney, who I'll tell you about in a minute, was the guy who mixed all the concrete for him, and he did it in a wheelbarrow. And they would build the forms, and he would pour the concrete in there. And those, I would say the fence itself must have been at least 10 or 12 inches square, and the post of which they was sitting on, they must have been at least 24 by 24.
And that stopped the
Oh,
cars
yeah.
from coming into your
Yeah.
porch.
As a matter of fact, every time one would run into it, he would pull the car around in the back and say, when you pay for the damages to the fence, you can have your car. So he was a diehard, what I call a Yankee Marine, because he was from McKeesport, Pennsylvania.
And what did that make you, since your father married a Southerner?
Well, it made me a one-half ding-a-ling, so-called a Yankee. Maybe I shouldn't say the word D-A-M-M, but anyway.
Okay. So
Anyway,
when you grew up, that's what they called you.
Oh yeah, I think they meant it too, because back then, you know, a lot of these people were still alive during the early 30s that remembered the Civil War, if not the Civil War, at least the carpetbaggers that we read about in history. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they were too happy about the situation they lost, but that's something that can't be overturned, so we have to live with it.
Now, your mother's name was Graves.
That's
Lois
correct.
Graves.
Yes.
And how was the Grave family influenced?
That was before my dad came into the picture. That was always the Graves house, the Graves property, and but then the reason they turned it into McGarvey's Corner was because my dad was always out front working, and back then it was a corner. A lot of people here in Sun City came to Hilton Head and so forth before 278 came in. Before 278, they know exactly what I was talking about. And but anyway, if anybody needed directions and they asked for the directions to Bluffton or to Hilton Head or whatever back in those days, they would ask the people where they stopped, how do I find it? They said, well, you go down to McGarvey's Corner and you'll find McGarvey's Corner, because Mr. McGarvey is always in the front yard working on his projects, and he will tell you exactly how to get there. And so it got the name of McGarvey's Corner, so it was really named after my dad in that respect.
Can you tell us about the schoolhouse that is still standing?
I understand that there was another schoolhouse down between here and Riverbend. And that schoolhouse eventually, I understand, burned. But it was exactly like the house, the schoolhouse, what we call a schoolhouse now, right there where you turn to go into Food Lion and so forth.
On 170, right there.
On 170, that's correct. But in those little one-room schoolhouses, it was only for whites back in those days. The blacks had their own school, and it was down across from where Island West Golf Course was. That has been destroyed, which I'm sorry they did it, because we certainly, to me, it was a good place to have for history. And because one of my best friends was named Amos Johnson. Now, Amos's dad was a deacon in his church, and of course, by the name Amos, you understand that he was from a black family. His mother was, she did all of our washing and ironing back in those days. And the washing was done in a big pot out with a fire built under it, and they boiled the clothes back in those days. And they used to iron the clothes with a flat iron that was always placed in front of a fireplace. And I had eaten many a meal off of that family dining room table, and with a fire going in the middle of the summer, where the iron is getting hot so she could do the ironing.
If someone wants to know the location of McGarvey's Corner, exactly where is it now?
Well, it's where the Legacy Medical Center is now.
Okay.
And I'll never forget, I was over there. Dr. Sharp is my cardiologist, and I was over there not too long ago, and I was looking out the window, and I said, you know, this building is just about on the same location, the house that I was raised in, before they tore it down. And I wonder if the old well and the pump and everything is out there. And I walked over there, and sure enough, there it was, standing, hadn't been touched, and but it was all covered by growth of the bushes and so forth. But they never tore it down. But that well used to be something that was well known in this section of the country, because I think it was about 200 feet deep. And if you pump the water out, you could see water beating around the pipe because it was so cold when it got up. Wow. And I'll never forget that back in those days, during the Depression, the darkies, as we call the black man, used to come to, my dad had a country store back then after he got out of the Marine Corps. And they would be going down in, across the Oconee River back to the right. It used to be swamps back in there, and they had a lot of gum trees. And they would cut down the gum trees, and with a foot axe, they would cut out cross ties for the railroad. That was the only job that they had that they could find to make any money back in those days. And they got so much for hewing out of one of the cross ties. But they would come up to his store at lunchtime, and I was always there with them, being a young kid and as curious as I've always been. And they'd buy a can of Eat Well sardines, a loaf of bread, and they'd always bring raw sweet potatoes with them. And they would make sandwiches out of the fish and the bread. They would go to the pump, and they would pump water, and they'd put it in a quart jar, and they would put cane syrup in it and make it their drink.
So they're very enterprising.
Yes, sir. Well, you had to. Wasn't anything else you could do.
Well, you were telling me growing up in the South that you mentioned a Joe Pinckney, and you also mentioned that you speak some Gullah. And could you speak some Gullah to me?
I ain't for me know what you talk about. If you understand, I did not understand what you were saying. I ain't for me know what you talk about.
Okay.
That's pretty close to real Gullah, because I have trouble sometimes understanding Gullah. Because when you go fishing, you know, you put the fish in the bottom of the barrel. You probably picked that one up, huh?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll teach you.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about Joe Pinckney.
Well, Joe Pinckney lived on our property, and the reason he was there is because Joe always was with my grandfather. He was on the boat when they would pull the barge from Barrow Landing around back of Hilton Head through the inland waterways to Savannah, because my grandfather was in the cotton gin business, he was in the lumber business, and he was in the turpentine business. And he would carry those supplies into Savannah, and he would come back, because he first started the old country store there, and bring supplies back for the store.
And how long would that trip take from Bluffton to Savannah?
Well, I would say they would probably be going close to a week.
Oh, and he would bring back supplies then for the general store.
Now, one trip they got caught in a hurricane coming back. Because back then, you didn't know it was a hurricane until it hit you. And if anybody knows where Dawes Island is, a few of you do know, but it's an island that's halfway between Paris Island or Beaufort and Hilton Head, in the middle of Port Royal Sound. As they were coming down, their boat sunk. They swam to Dawes Island till the hurricane was over. Then they swam back across the river. Well, the family at all that time figured, because of the hurricane, never heard you. How'd you hear from people back in those days, unless you were looking each other in the eye? They saw the two of them walking down the Bluffton Road to the head, you know, coming back home, and that's just by the grace of the good Lord they made it. But anyway,
that's an amazing story.
Well, I tell you, this country is an amazing story when you think about it, and I only know just a portion of it. But the Pinckneys, Joe Pinckney was a black man, and his mother was a slave to the Pinckneys, and I don't know how Joe and my grandfather got together, but this was right after slavery was abolished. But Joe did not want to be a free man, I guess you'd call it, because he stayed in a house behind our house. All he wanted was food to eat, clothes to wear, smoking and chewing tobacco, and 50 cents on Friday so he could go down to Pinckney Colony Road, where there was a couple of black families that lived on the left side of the road going toward the church. And that 50 cents, he would come back Sunday skunk drunk, as we called him. He just drank moonshine the whole weekend. But other than that, he didn't touch it during the week. And
he just did his work.
He just wanted his weekend, man. He undoubtedly enjoyed it, because but he would walk all the way down there and back. And but Joe, I was raised with Joe. I was raised by Joe, to be honest with you, because I spent a lot of time with him in the back talking about different things. But he took care of the whole backyard. We had chickens. We had we had everything. I can remember when they used to share the sheep that we had. And back then, you'd share the sheep and ship the wool to Iowa. And they would, for half of the wool, they would make blankets out of the other half and ship the blankets back to you. It was all barter back in those days. Oh, and it was amazing how you can survive when you don't have Walmart, and when you don't have Food Lion, and you don't have places to go eat. Everything was done there.
Well, you have experienced so many changes in this area, and you now live in Sun City. Warren, you were telling me about when you graduated from high school. Tell us a little about what you did after that. Okay,
as you know, I went to Ridgeland, graduated from there. I had an appointment to Annapolis because my dad, being in the service and in the position he was in, and had an attorney right to Washington, and they gave me an appointment to Annapolis. But my dad, I asked him, from there I went to Carlisle Military School for a year of prep, because at Ridgeland and at Bluffton, I guess algebra was my top math, no chemistry. I wasn't prepared to go to Annapolis, so they sent me there to get some prep. From there I went to the Citadel. My first semester at the Citadel was the last semester of hazing back before the war, or during the war. But I asked my dad when I came at Christmas I came because December the 7th is when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and I was at the Citadel at that time. I asked him, I said, Dad, what do you think I should do? I don't want to get drafted, and I was still 17, and I said, I don't want to be drafted. And he said, he said, I'll tell you what, if you go to college and you get your commission, if you get an Army commission, in 6 months you'll be on the front line with a rifle, because they need people to fight. He said, if you go in the Marine Corps, you'll be leading them up the beach. And he said, if you're in the Navy, you may never see a ship. I said, well, I don't want to go in the Navy and never see a ship. I want to serve. And I said, I love the water to begin with, and so forth. And he said, you do what you think's best for you, son. I'm not going to tell you what to do.
Good advice.
So anyway, before I was 18 on the 3rd of February. On the 1st of February, I joined the Navy on a minority enlistment. And a minority enlistment, you had to stay in 3 years, but at the end of 3 years, you were then a hash-marked sailor. And a hash-marked sailor was a guy who served 4 years. And but you can't get out, you have to. So it turned out that I then went to get my physical. And I was gray-green colorblind, and I couldn't go to Annapolis. The good Lord takes care of dummies like me, I guarantee you, because if I had gone there, I'd have stepped off the bus and I'd step right back on another bus going home, because I wasn't qualified, educational-wise. I could plant pine trees, as all of you know. You got a few in your yard, I bet you. But it turned out that from there, they had started a new program at the University of South Carolina for the naval officer training. And if you did not serve below decks on a ship, color blindness made no difference if you were above decks all the time. So I transferred from the Citadel over there. Well, when I got to integral calculus, I couldn't spell it, so therefore I had to leave college and I went into the real Navy. I was on board ship, took 14 trips across the North Atlantic. I was on a destroyer escort, convoy duty. And so that was, and then as soon as the war was over in Germany, or in Europe, I came back. We decommissioned our ship at Green Cove Springs, Florida. And in decommissioning a ship, you put the ship in mothballs, is what they really call it. And then I was, believe it or not, I was in the service 3 years, 18 days, and so many hours.
And so how old were you then when you?
Well, I was 21.
21.
I was qualified to come out at that point, so which I did. I didn't want to have a career in the Navy at all. Right after I came back home, I got married to a young lady out of Savannah. Oh, by the way, being a country boy, I went over to Savannah to get me a city slicker. Well, that didn't work out, so I went back. I was living in Savannah at the time, and I ended up with a real city slicker. I'm telling you, she was something else. She's quite a lady, and it's amazing that how things turn out in your life.
And how did you meet her?
I met her at a little place called Roy's Sugar Shack. It was a little bar down the street from where I had my business. And to be honest with you, it was the only place that I found. She and Roy were personal friends, and so I met her there. And it was the only place that would hold my checks on payday so they wouldn't bounce when I paid my personnel. But, I'm telling you, life's been a struggle, but it's been a nice struggle.
I just love hearing about all of your stories, and I think we could probably spend hours here talking with you. It's been such a pleasure to have you here on the Sun City TV News.
Thank you.
And I want to congratulate you for just living in this area and making a wonderful life for you and for Mary. On behalf of Sun City TV, we hope you've enjoyed this little bit of history with Warren McGarvey. Until next time, this is Elaine Ragland, Sun City TV.